Prepare to delve into a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. There are stories history books prefer to forget, narratives so disturbing they were deliberately erased from official records. Today, we'll unearth one of those stories literally. Comment where you're watching from and prepare to learn one of the darkest secrets of the Appalachian Mountains. It was the late 19th century, a time when the mountainous regions of eastern West Virginia still held impenetrable mysteries. Isolated communities lived by their own rules, far from the eyes of federal law. The rugged terrain and dense forests created the perfect setting for certain events to remain hidden for generations. In those days, disappearing in the mountains was more common than one might think. Travelers vanished without a trace, entire families simply disappeared from census records, and few asked questions. Life was hard, even brutal, and death was a constant companion in those forgotten lands. It was in this context that Elias Ransom emerged, a man whose existence has been virtually erased from historical records. Born around 1843, Ransom grew up in the arid hills of Greenbrier County, a region known for its deep caves and secluded valleys. By the age of 52, when the events we are about to narrate became known to the authorities, he had already built a local reputation that oscillated between cautious respect and genuine fear. He worked as an informal gravedigger, a profession that at that time required neither licensing nor supervision in rural areas. Elias offered his services to families who could not afford traditional funerals or who lived too far from cities to access conventional funeral services. The Appalachian Mountains have always had their own traditions surrounding death. Burials took place on private property, family cemeteries dotted the slopes, and men like Ransom provided a necessary service in a society where sudden death from disease, accident, or violence was commonplace. He knew every trail, every hidden clearing, every abandoned cemetery nestled among ancient trees. Ransom was said to have a knack for finding suitable resting places, places where the earth was soft and the soil deep. But there was something in the thin, stooped man's eyes that made people look away, something that suggested knowledge beyond the gravedigger's trade. The first official mention of Elias Ransom in Greenbrier County records dates back to 1891, when a local farmer reported to the sheriff that his wife had disappeared after hiring Ransom to bury her father on a remote property. The farmer explained that the woman had left one autumn morning accompanied only by the gravedigger, carrying the patriarch's body in a mule-drawn wagon. She was supposed to return before nightfall but was never seen again. Ransom appeared in town 3 days later, alone, claiming he had completed his work and that the woman had decided to stay a few days at the old family property to sort through her belongings. The story seemed plausible, and no one investigated further. After all, adult women had the right to come and go as they pleased, and it was not uncommon for someone to spend weeks tending to abandoned properties. But that wasn't an isolated case. Over the following months, other people who had hired Ransom for funeral services began reporting strange disappearances. A brother who was supposed to help with the burial never returned. A widow who accompanied the gravedigger to her husband's grave simply vanished. A man who went to settle inheritance matters at a distant estate, guided by Ransom, never returned home. The patterns were always the same: people traveling alone or in small groups to remote locations, always accompanied by Elias Ransom, and then disappearing without a trace. Families searched the designated areas, but the mountains were vast and the paths countless. Finding someone who didn't want to be found or who had gotten lost was virtually impossible in that wild territory. The county sheriff, a man named William Hutchinson, became suspicious when he realized all the disappearances had a common denominator. Hutchinson was a Civil War veteran, experienced in investigations, and suspicious by nature. He spent weeks reviewing old reports, talking to grieving families and plotting routes in the mountains. What he discovered was disturbing. In just 2 years, at least 17 people had disappeared after hiring or accompanying Elias Ransom on journeys to funerals or visits to remote estates. 17 souls who simply dissolved into the mountain mist. But suspicions weren't proof, and Ransom always had reasonable explanations. People decided to take other paths, changed their minds, found opportunities in other regions. The vastness of Appalachia swallowed stories like the earth swallows seeds. It was only when a survivor emerged that the truth began to emerge from the shadows. A 23-year-old named Thomas Merrick managed to escape a situation that, according to his account to the sheriff, nearly cost him his life. Merrick had hired Ransom to bury his uncle in a family estate abandoned for decades, located in a deep valley 3 days' ride from the nearest town. During the journey, Ransom was cordial and helpful, knowledgeable about every shortcut and water source. But when they reached their destination, something changed. Stay tuned to discover what Thomas Merrick revealed to the authorities, a revelation that would finally expose the terrible secrets Elias Ransom kept deep within the Appalachian Mountains. Thomas Merrick's account to Sheriff Hutchinson was recorded in detail in the Greenbrier County archives, documents that remained sealed for decades before being partially released for historical reference. According to Merrick, after completing his uncle's burial in a secluded clearing, Ransom suggested they spend the night in a nearby abandoned cabin, claiming the return trail was dangerous in the dark. The young man accepted, exhausted by the journey and the emotional toll of the funeral. It was during that night that everything changed in a frightening way. Merrick awoke before dawn with a feeling that something was wrong. The cabin was too quiet, and Ransom was not in his makeshift sleeping bag. The young man got up cautiously and noticed a faint light coming from a nearby building he hadn't noticed the day before, something that looked like a barn or warehouse half obscured by vegetation. Driven by curiosity and an unsettling sense of foreboding, Merrick approached the structure. What he saw through the cracks in the rotting wood left him paralyzed with terror. Ransom was inside, lit by a lamp, methodically digging in the packed dirt floor. But he wasn't alone in the space. Scattered around were possessions, personal items that clearly belonged to no one who had lived in this long-abandoned place. Thomas didn't wait to see more. Silently, he returned to the cabin, feigned sleep, and awaited Ransom's return. When the gravedigger finally entered, shortly before sunrise, Merrick kept his eyes closed while the older man settled in. For the next few hours, the young man played the role of the innocent traveler, chatting normally as they planned their return. But his mind raced, searching for a way to escape. The opportunity arose when Ransom set out to fetch water from a nearby stream. Merrick grabbed his horse and galloped like he had never galloped in his life, following the trail back without looking back. It took 2 days of almost non-stop riding to reach town and head straight for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Hutchinson wasted no time. He assembled a group of 8 armed men, including 2 federal deputies who were in the area investigating illegal liquor smuggling. The expedition set out following Merrick's directions, who, despite his fear, agreed to guide them to the location. The 3-day journey was tense, with everyone keeping weapons handy and eyes peeled for any movement in the dense forest. When they finally reached the abandoned property, they found everything exactly as Merrick had described. The clearing with the freshly dug grave, the decaying cabin, and just a few feet away, the structure that resembled an old barn. Ransom was not there. There were signs that he had left in a hurry, leaving behind a few belongings and tools. But what the search team found in that barn would forever change the history of that region. The dirt floor had been dug up in several spots, creating irregular depressions that hinted at something deeply disturbing. Among the abandoned objects were clothes, shoes, travel bags, personal documents, and even money, things no one would leave behind voluntarily. There was also a leather-bound notebook, somewhat deteriorated by the humidity, containing notes that would take investigators weeks to fully decipher. The sheriff ordered them to begin carefully excavating areas where the soil appeared to have been recently disturbed. What they discovered over the next few hours confirmed Hutchinson's worst fears. I won't go into the details of what was found, but I can say that the evidence was compelling and disturbing enough that the case became a top priority for authorities. Messengers were sent to every town and village within a 100-mile radius, warning of Elias Ransom and instructing anyone who spotted him to notify authorities immediately without attempting to confront him. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded to other locations where Ransom had worked. Teams were dispatched to remote properties, abandoned cemeteries, and other areas frequented by the gravedigger. At each location, they found more evidence that painted a terrifying picture. The notebook found in the barn turned out to be a personal record of sorts, albeit written in encrypted and fragmentary form. Handwriting experts at the time were able to interpret parts of the contents, discovering references to dates, names, and locations that corresponded to the reported disappearances. There were mentions of amounts of money, descriptions of valuable belongings, and notes about specific routes in the mountains. What began as suspicions about a few disappearances quickly escalated into an investigation of alarming proportions. Local newspapers began covering the case, albeit cautiously due to the sensitive nature of the matter. The Greenbrier Independent published an article in its October 1893 issue titled simply "Mystery in the Mountains," without mentioning names or specific details, but everyone in the region knew what it was about. The story began to spread to other counties, and soon authorities as far away as Kentucky and Tennessee began reporting disappearances with similar circumstances, always involving trips to remote areas accompanied by local guides or workers. But where was Elias Ransom? The man had disappeared in the same mountains where he had operated for so many years. He knew every cave, every hidden trail, every abandoned cabin. For a man with his knowledge of the territory, remaining invisible was perfectly possible. The searches continued for weeks, then months, with no sign of the gravedigger. Some believed he had fled west, perhaps to the still unorganized territories where the law was even more lax. Others suspected he remained in the mountains, watching from afar as authorities dug into his dark past. The psychological impact on the community was profound. Families who had lost loved ones under mysterious circumstances now faced the terrifying possibility that their disappearances were neither accidents nor voluntary choices. Trust among neighbors was shaken, especially in the most isolated areas where everyone depended on each other for survival. People began to question how many others like Ransom might be operating across the vast expanses of Appalachia, exploiting the isolation and vulnerability of remote communities. Stay with us to discover what else was revealed about Elias Ransom's activities and how authorities handled a case that challenged everything they knew about crime and justice at the time. As the investigation progressed, Sheriff Hutchinson realized he was dealing with something much larger than he had initially imagined. Official records began to reveal a pattern that spanned years, perhaps decades. Ransom was not just an opportunistic gravedigger, but someone who had meticulously built a network of operations across several counties. He knew the most isolated families, knew who owned distant lands inherited from previous generations, and identified people traveling alone carrying valuables or important documents. He was a patient predator who chose his victims with calculated care. County records showed that Ransom had moved constantly between different regions of Appalachia. He would spend a few months in Greenbrier County, then appear in Pocahontas County, and then be seen in Monroe County. This mobility made it difficult for any local authority to discern the full pattern of his actions. Each sheriff saw only one or two isolated cases, disappearances that could be explained by the natural hardships of mountain life. Only when Hutchinson began exchanging correspondence with other counties did the true magnitude of the situation emerge from the shadows. A particularly disturbing detail emerged when investigators examined the available financial records more closely. Ransom lived modestly, without displaying ostentatious wealth, but he occasionally deposited considerable sums in banks in different cities. These deposits always came after periods when people disappeared. The amounts varied, but some reached hundreds of dollars, a fortune at the time. Where did this money come from? The obvious answer was that he looted his victims' belongings, but there was something more sinister about the transactions. In some cases, Ransom had sold properties using transfer documents that appeared legitimate at first glance, but upon closer inspection revealed irregularities in the way they were signed. The investigation also revealed that Ransom maintained relationships with dubious figures in several communities. There were horse traders who didn't ask questions about the origin of the animals he sold, store owners who bought tools and personal items without questioning their origin, and even some minor officials who accepted small bribes to overlook inconsistencies in documents. He had built a network of silent complicity, not necessarily because these people knew about his crimes, but because everyone benefited from not asking inconvenient questions. In isolated Appalachian communities, survival often depended on willful blindness to the activities of neighbors. The case gained national attention when newspapers in larger cities like Charleston and Richmond began publishing stories about what they called the mountain gravedigger mystery. The press maintained a relatively restrained tone, avoiding excessive sensationalism, but public interest was immense. Letters arrived from across the country reporting similar cases, unexplained disappearances in mountainous regions, people who set off for funerals or visits to remote properties and never returned. Federal authorities began to consider the possibility that other individuals were operating in similar ways in different parts of the country. Meanwhile, The search for Elias Ransom intensified. Rewards totaling $500 were offered, a significant sum that attracted bounty hunters and adventurers from various regions. Organized groups scoured the mountains, following rumors and clues that invariably led to dead ends. Some people swore they had seen him in distant taverns. Others reported encounters on remote trails with a man matching his description. But each time authorities arrived at the indicated locations, Ransom had already vanished again, like smoke dissipating through the trees. The tension in mountain communities became palpable. Many families who had lived isolated began to question every stranger who appeared, every offer of help with heavy work or trail knowledge. Paranoia set in some areas, with neighbors suspicious of each other, former friends viewed with suspicion. The social fabric of these communities, already fragile due to isolation and economic hardship, began to unravel. Some families abandoned remote properties, preferring the relative safety of smaller towns to remaining vulnerable in the mountains. Investigators continued to examine Ransom's locations. On a property in Pocahontas County, they found another structure similar to the Greenbrier barn. More personal belongings, more signs of recent activity, more evidence confirming their worst fears. It was as if Ransom had established several operating points throughout the mountains, strategically chosen for their distance from any settlement and difficult access. Each of these locations told a silent story of tragedies that would likely never be fully understood. One aspect that particularly intrigued investigators was the psychological aspect. How could someone maintain a facade of normalcy while committing such horrific acts? Ransom interacted regularly with people in the cities, frequented businesses, and maintained seemingly normal conversations. Some who knew him described him as quiet but polite, a man who seemed to carry the weight of a difficult life, but who displayed no obvious signs of danger. This ability to camouflage his true nature made him all the more frightening. He was not the obvious monster of folk tales, but someone who could be anyone, invisible until it was too late. Months passed, and winter descended on Appalachia, bringing heavy snow and freezing temperatures that made searches nearly impossible. Operations were temporarily suspended, with plans to resume the following spring. During this period of forced inactivity, Sheriff Hutchinson dedicated himself to organizing all the information gathered, creating a comprehensive dossier on Elias Ransom that would be shared with authorities in multiple states. The document was over 100 handwritten pages long, detailing timelines, locations, evidence descriptions, and theories about how the gravedigger operated. It was meticulous work that Hutchinson hoped would help prevent future tragedies, even if Ransom was never captured. But the story was far from over. Stay with us to discover the surprising twist that occurred the following spring, when an unexpected event brought new developments to the case that had kept the entire region in suspense. Spring of 1894 arrived in the Appalachian Mountains, with the usual thaw and regrowth of vegetation. With the weather improving, authorities were preparing to resume the search when something completely unexpected happened. A telegram arrived at Sheriff Hutchinson's office from a small town called Grafton, located in Taylor County, approximately 80 miles to the north. The message's content was disconcerting. A man matching Elias Ransom's description had voluntarily appeared at the local police station, claiming to be ready to speak with authorities. Hutchinson set off immediately, accompanied by 2 deputies, making the 2-day journey to Grafton with a mixture of anticipation and suspicion. Could this be a trap, an imposter seeking notoriety? Or was this really the gravedigger who had become a near-mythical figure in recent months? When they finally arrived at the small Grafton police station, they found a man sitting calmly in a cell, drinking coffee and chatting amiably with the local sheriff. It was Elias Ransom, without a doubt. The man seemed to have aged considerably since his last descriptions, with grayer hair and a general look of profound exhaustion, but his eyes still retained that unsettling quality so many had mentioned. What followed was a series of interrogations lasting several days. Ransom proved surprisingly cooperative, answering questions with disconcerting calm. He confirmed his identity, admitted to living in the mountains during the winter in caves and abandoned cabins, and acknowledged being aware that authorities were seeking him. But when questioned directly about the disappearances and the evidence found on his properties, his narrative took an unexpected turn. Ransom claimed that much of what authorities had uncovered was the result of misunderstandings and tragic coincidences. He claimed he worked with people who wanted to disappear voluntarily, fleeing debt, unhappy marriages, or legal trouble. His explanation was elaborate and, in some respects, even plausible within the context of the time. Ransom claimed that many people in isolated Appalachian communities lived under oppressive circumstances and sought opportunities to start a new life elsewhere. He allegedly offered to help these people disappear, providing safe routes through the mountains, false documents when possible, and even purchasing property from those who wished to liquidate their assets before leaving. The belongings found were items left behind by these people, things they did not want to carry into their new lives. The money he deposited in banks would come from legitimate transactions involving the sale of property and personal property. Sheriff Hutchinson listened with growing frustration. Ransom's narrative was too convenient, impossible to fully prove or disprove without locating the supposed missing people. And conveniently, according to the gravedigger, these people had scattered across different states and territories, changed their names, and started completely new lives far from Appalachia. How could he prove this wasn't true? How could he definitively demonstrate that these people hadn't left voluntarily? The justice system of the time faced severe limitations in handling such cases. Photographs were not widely available, centralized databases were lacking, and communication between different jurisdictions was slow and precarious. But Hutchinson wasn't naive. He confronted Ransom with specific evidence, cases where entire families had reported immediate concern when their relatives failed to return, situations where disappearances had left devastating financial consequences that made no sense if the person had been planning to flee. There was also the testimony of Thomas Merrick, the young man who had fled in terror from that abandoned property. How could Ransom explain the young man's genuine fear? The gravedigger replied with unnerving calm that Merrick had probably misinterpreted something he'd seen, perhaps Ransom himself organizing belongings left by previous clients. People see what they expect to see, especially when they're nervous and far from home. During the interrogations, one thing became clear to everyone present. Elias Ransom was intelligent, articulate, and extremely careful with his words. He never contradicted himself, never admitted anything beyond what was already documented, and always maintained an alternative explanation for every accusation. It was like playing chess against a chess master who could see 10 moves ahead. The lawyers who began working on the case quickly realized that it would be extremely difficult to build a solid case based on the available evidence. Testimony from missing persons was, by definition, impossible to obtain. Circumstantial evidence abounded, but direct evidence was elusive. The West Virginia legal community found itself in an unprecedented dilemma. Everyone felt deep down that Ransom was guilty of terrible crimes, but the justice system required concrete evidence, not intuition or suspicion, no matter how well founded. The case began to attract attention from legal scholars in other parts of the country, some seeing it as an important test of the limits of the law in missing persons cases. Articles were published in legal journals discussing the philosophical and practical complexities of prosecuting someone when there were no identified bodies, direct witnesses to crimes, or even definitive proof that crimes had occurred. Meanwhile, Ransom remained detained on several minor charges related to document fraud and irregular business transactions. These charges could keep him in jail for a while, but they didn't reflect the true nature of what authorities believed he had done. The Greenbrier County District Attorney, an experienced man named Harrison Caldwell, worked tirelessly to build a case that could stand trial. Caldwell reviewed every document, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and consulted with forensic experts of the time, all in the hope of finding that incontrovertible piece of evidence that would turn suspicion into a conviction. The months passed, and the Elias Ransom case became an obsession for many involved. Hutchinson devoted almost all his time to the investigation, neglecting other aspects of his job as sheriff. Caldwell postponed other cases to focus exclusively on Ransom. Families of missing people regularly traveled to Grafton, hoping the gravedigger would finally reveal what had happened to their loved ones. But Ransom stuck to his story, repeating it with minor variations whenever questioned. He even offered to write letters trying to locate some of the people he claimed had left voluntarily, but these letters never received a reply, which Ransom explained as natural, given that these people didn't want to be found. Public pressure mounted. Newspapers demanded justice, communities demanded answers. Politicians promised reforms to the legal system to better handle similar cases in the future. But none of this changed the fundamental reality. Prosecuting Elias Ransom for capital crimes would be extremely risky without more solid evidence. A jury would need to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, and the alternative narrative Ransom presented, convenient as it seemed, created exactly that kind of doubt. Stay with us to discover how this impasse was finally resolved and what fate awaited the man known as the Appalachian gravedigger. The legal impasse surrounding Elias Ransom was about to resolve itself in a way no one had anticipated. In the summer of 1894, while he was awaiting trial on minor fraud charges, something extraordinary happened. A telegram arrived at the Grafton police station from a remote village called Marlinton in Pocahontas County. The content was brief but shocking. A group of hunters had discovered something in the mountains that might be related to the Ransom case. Sheriff Hutchinson immediately set out with a small team, making the 3-day journey to this isolated region. What the hunters had found was a cave hidden by dense vegetation, located in an area so remote that decades likely passed between visits. The entrance was narrow, nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. Inside, the investigators discovered what appeared to be an organized warehouse. Suitcases, trunks, and boxes were neatly stacked, containing clothing, documents, and personal belongings to dozens of different people. Some items had deteriorated from the humidity, but many remained in reasonably good condition due to the constant temperature and protection from the elements. It was like discovering a macabre time capsule, a physical archive of interrupted lives. Among the documents were birth certificates, property deeds, personal letters, old photographs, and even wills. The names on these papers corresponded to many of the people reported missing in recent years. There were also notebooks similar to those found previously, with entries that could now be compared and contextualized. One of the notebooks contained something particularly revealing, a detailed record of financial transactions, including amounts received from the sale of properties and assets, specific dates that perfectly coincided with the reported disappearances, and even comments on the ease or difficulty of completing certain transactions. This discovery completely changed the legal landscape of the case. There was now solid documentary evidence connecting Ransom directly to the assets of missing people, evidence that contradicted his narrative of being a mere intermediary in voluntary disappearances. Why would someone planning to flee voluntarily leave behind essential documents like property deeds and birth certificates? Why would they abandon family photographs, sentimental objects, and personal letters? These were things people took with them, especially when starting a new life. The existence of this hidden cache suggested something far more sinister. Prosecutor Caldwell finally had what he needed. He spent weeks organizing the evidence, building a case that would weave together all the pieces of the puzzle. Documents were authenticated, handwriting was analyzed by experts, and families were contacted to identify belongings of their missing loved ones. Every item in the cave was a piece of evidence, every entry in the notebooks an additional line of evidence. Caldwell constructed an alternative narrative to Ransom's, one in which the gravedigger was not a benevolent helper, but rather someone who preyed on his victims' vulnerability and isolation. In September 1894, Elias Ransom was formally charged with multiple crimes including large-scale fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The most serious charges remained legally complicated due to the lack of definitive physical evidence of violence, but the volume of material found in the cave was devastating. The trial was scheduled for early the following year, allowing time for all the evidence to be properly catalogued and for witnesses from different regions to be called. News of the impending trial spread quickly. Dozens of families who had lost loved ones under mysterious circumstances began planning trips to attend the proceedings. Regional press and even some newspapers from larger cities sent correspondents to cover what promised to be one of the most significant trials of the decade. The small Taylor County courthouse, where the case was to be heard due to Ransom's imprisonment location, could not accommodate all the interested parties. Special arrangements were made, including the possibility of holding some sessions in a larger community hall, but Elias Ransom had other plans. On the night of November 19, 1894, approximately 3 months before his scheduled trial, he disappeared from his cell at the Grafton police station. The circumstances of his escape were murky and embarrassing to local authorities. The cell showed no signs of forced entry, the bars remained intact, and the locks had not been forced. Ransom was simply gone when the guard made his morning rounds. Rumors immediately began to circulate about possible complicity within the station itself, bribes, and favoritism. An internal investigation was launched, but it never produced any definitive conclusions. Ransom's escape was a devastating blow to everyone who had worked tirelessly on the case. Sheriff Hutchinson felt personally responsible, even though Ransom's custody was technically under the responsibility of Grafton authorities. Developer Caldwell saw months of legal preparation potentially rendered irrelevant. The victims' families felt as if justice had been stolen from them once again. Frustration and anger were palpable throughout the region. How had someone so wanted, so closely watched, simply disappeared again? Theories abounded. Some believed Ransom had been aided by previously unknown accomplices, perhaps people who feared exposure if the trial proceeded. Others suspected he had offered part of his hidden fortune in exchange for assistance in his escape. Some even suggested that corrupt officials at higher levels of the state government had facilitated his release to avoid political embarrassment related to the systematic failures that had allowed Ransom to operate with impunity for so long. The truth, like so much else about Elias Ransom, remained shrouded in mystery. A massive manhunt was immediately organized. Hundreds of men scoured the mountains around Grafton, following trails, checking caves, and questioning residents of isolated cabins. Checkpoints were established on major roads and railroads. Telegraph operators were instructed to alert every town within a 200-mile radius, but it was like searching for a shadow in the darkness. Ransom knew these mountains better than anyone, had experience living off the land, and knew how to move unseen through the wilderness. If he decided to disappear into the depths of the Appalachians, finding him would be nearly impossible. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Occasional reports arrived from different regions, always from someone who swore they had seen Ransom, but each investigation revealed cases of mistaken identity or simply false information. The reward for his capture was increased to $1,000, an extraordinary sum that attracted even more bounty hunters and adventurers. But all returned empty-handed, frustrated by the impossibility of locating a single man in such a vast expanse of mountainous, densely forested territory. Stay with us to discover what finally happened to Elias Ransom and how his dark legacy would continue to haunt the Appalachian Mountains for generations. The months following Elias Ransom's escape were marked by a collective sense of unease that spread throughout the Appalachian region. Isolated communities lived in renewed fear. Every stranger who appeared was viewed with extreme suspicion. Every offer of help met with hesitation. The gravedigger had become an almost ghostly figure, an invisible presence who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Stories began to emerge, reports of sightings that were never confirmed, rumors that he was living in deep caves or had built hidden shelters in places so remote that no map indicated them. The winter of 1894 to 1895 was particularly severe in the mountains. Blizzards blocked trails, temperatures plummeted to dangerous levels, and many communities were completely isolated for weeks. During this period, the search for Ransom was virtually suspended out of practical necessity. Some speculated that he would not survive the harsh winter, especially if he had been living outdoors in the mountains. Others believed that a man with his experience and knowledge of the terrain had surely found ways to survive, perhaps in one of the countless abandoned cabins scattered throughout the forests. When spring arrived and the search resumed, a curious pattern began to emerge. Several remote cabins showed signs of having been inhabited during the winter, with the remains of campfires, partially consumed provisions, and even some tools left behind. But it was impossible to determine whether Ransom had been to these places, or whether it was simply other travelers, hunters, or similarly isolated individuals who used these shelters. The Appalachian Mountains have always had their population of individuals living on the margins of society, hermits, fugitives, people who simply preferred isolation to community life. Distinguishing Ransom's activities from those of others was a nearly impossible task. The case gradually began to fade from the headlines, not because it had ceased to be important, but because the lack of new developments made it difficult to maintain public interest. Sheriff Hutchinson remained dedicated to the investigation, but he also had to attend to other duties of his office. Prosecutor Caldwell kept the case technically open, all evidence carefully preserved in case Ransom was ever recaptured. But both knew that with each passing month, the chances of seeing justice served diminished considerably. Then something unexpected happened in the summer of 1895. A farmer in Webster County, a region south of where Ransom had primarily operated, reported finding a number of shallowly buried objects on a property he had recently acquired. Among these objects were documents, some personal belongings, and something particularly intriguing, more notebooks with similar entries to those found previously. The farmer, familiar with Ransom's story through the newspapers, immediately contacted the authorities. An investigative team was dispatched and spent days carefully excavating the area. What they discovered was another deposit, smaller than the previously discovered cave, but equally revealing. It contained belongings of people whose disappearances had never been officially connected to Ransom, further expanding the likely scope of his activities. Among the documents was correspondence suggesting that Ransom maintained contact with individuals in other regions, possibly a network of facilitators who aided his operations. Names were identified, and secondary investigations were opened to locate these individuals. But here, the story takes another dark turn. When authorities attempted to trace some of the names mentioned in the correspondence, they discovered that several of these people had also disappeared under mysterious circumstances in recent years. It was as if Ransom systematically eliminated even those who might have known about his activities. The web of disappearances grew increasingly complex and disturbing. Each new discovery revealed additional layers of meticulous planning and execution. This was no impulsive or opportunistic criminal, but someone who operated with a calculated method over years. The discovery in Webster County brought renewed interest to the case. Newspapers resumed publishing articles, and authorities in other states began investigating possible connections to unsolved cases in their own jurisdictions. The disturbing possibility slowly emerged that Ransom had not been working alone all along, but rather that he was part of a larger operation, perhaps involving multiple individuals in different regions of Appalachia. If true, the implications were terrifying. How many other people like Ransom might be operating in the vast expanses of mountainous territory where law enforcement had difficulty reaching? During this period, Sheriff Hutchinson received an anonymous letter that deeply disturbed him. The letter, posted from a town he chose not to disclose publicly, contained detailed information about the locations of 3 more hidden storage facilities in different counties. The information was too specific to be fabricated. Approximate coordinates based on natural landmarks, descriptions of terrain features, even warnings about difficult access. Hutchinson discreetly organized expeditions to these locations, and surprisingly, they all existed exactly as described. Each contained more evidence, more belongings of missing persons, more fragments of the dark puzzle. Who had sent that letter? Why would someone provide such information anonymously? Theories abounded. Some believed it was an accomplice of Ransom's who, for reasons of his own, had decided to betray his partner. Others suspected it was Ransom himself, perhaps seeking some perverse form of recognition for his actions, or perhaps trying to direct the investigation to serve some hidden agenda. Some even suggested it was someone completely unrelated who had stumbled upon this information and wanted no direct involvement with the authorities for personal reasons. Hutchinson attempted to trace the letter's origin through the postal service, but the post office town was large enough that finding the sender was impractical. The handwriting was compared with Ransom's samples, but experts were unable to reach definitive conclusions. The letter had been written deliberately in a disguised manner, possibly with the non-dominant hand, making handwriting analysis extremely difficult. It was yet another mystery added to an already extensive collection of unanswered questions. The discoveries resulting from the anonymous letter brought some closure to some families, who were finally able to confirm the fate of their loved ones through the identification of personal belongings. But this closure was accompanied by renewed grief, the confirmation of terrible suspicions that many had silently carried for years. Memorial services were held in several communities, collective moments of mourning for lives lost and for an innocence that had been shattered by the revelation that such profound evil could exist so close to home. Meanwhile, Elias Ransom remained at large, a shadow haunting the mountains. His escape and subsequent disappearance became legendary, fueling stories that would be told around campfires for generations. Some began to doubt his continued existence, suggesting he had likely perished in the mountains during that harsh winter. Others swore they had seen him, always in glimpses, always in remote places, always disappearing before any confirmation was possible. Stay with us to discover the final outcome of this dark story and the lasting legacy the Appalachian gravedigger left in the mountains that were once his hunting grounds. The year 1896 brought significant changes to the way authorities approached the Elias Ransom case. As time passed, and there remained a persistent lack of concrete clues as to his whereabouts, the strategy shifted from an active manhunt to patient surveillance. Permanent outposts were established in strategic locations throughout the mountains, with guards instructed to observe and report any suspicious activity. Local informants were discreetly recruited, people living in the most remote regions who could spot subtle changes in the environment that indicated the presence of someone trying to remain hidden. Sheriff Hutchinson, now recognized as the foremost authority on the Ransom case, began receiving inquiries from other jurisdictions facing similar situations. Cases of unexplained disappearances in the mountainous regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, and even parts of North Carolina showed patterns reminiscent of Ransom's operations. Hutchinson traveled extensively during this period, sharing his findings and investigative methodologies with other sheriffs and prosecutors. These trips revealed something deeply disturbing. The problem was much broader than anyone had imagined. In isolated communities throughout the Appalachian Mountains, similar stories emerged when someone finally asked the right questions. People who had disappeared decades ago, cases dismissed as accidents or voluntary departures, began to look suspicious in a new light. Patterns repeated themselves: lone travelers, promises of help with burials or property transactions, journeys to remote locations, subsequent disappearances. It was as if a dark practice had developed over generations in these mountains, exploiting the isolation and the difficulty of communication between different regions. Hutchinson began to theorize that Ransom wasn't unique, but rather part of an unofficial tradition that had existed in Appalachia for much longer than he had initially suspected. Perhaps there were others before Ransom, individuals who developed similar methods and who were simply never discovered because the conditions weren't right, because no one connected the dots, because the victims were often marginalized people whose disappearances didn't generate serious investigations. This possibility was frightening in its implications. How many lives had been lost over the years deep in those mountains? During this period of deepening understanding of the case, something happened that brought new urgency to the investigation. In the fall of 1896, a woman appeared at a police station in Fayette County claiming to have escaped a dangerous situation involving a man matching Ransom's description. According to her account, she had been approached by this man who offered to help her sell inherited property in a remote area. During the drive to the location, something about his behavior made her deeply uncomfortable, and she managed to escape when they stopped to rest at a tavern near a small town. The woman provided specific details about the man's appearance, his manner of speech, even scars and distinctive marks that matched known descriptions of Ransom. Most importantly, she had noted the general direction he had headed after his escape. A search operation was quickly organized, with teams converging on the indicated area. For 3 weeks, dozens of men systematically scoured a region of approximately 50 square miles of dense forest and mountainous terrain. They found signs of recent human presence: extinguished campfires, temporary shelters, even some items that might have belonged to Ransom, but the man himself remained elusive. The search was eventually suspended as weather conditions deteriorated, but something important had changed. There was now confirmation that Ransom was alive and still operating in the mountains. This renewed authorities' commitment and brought renewed media attention. Newspapers published detailed notices about Ransom, including updated physical descriptions based on the testimony of the escaped woman. Posters were distributed throughout the region's towns and villages, offering an increased reward of $1,500 for information leading to his capture. But as 1897 approached, a sense of resignation began to set in. Ransom had demonstrated a remarkable ability to avoid capture, to adapt, and to survive in the most adverse conditions. Some began to accept the possibility that he would never be captured, that he would live out the rest of his days as a ghostly presence in the mountains, occasionally appearing only to disappear again before any action could be taken. For the victims' families, this prospect was torturous. The absence of formal justice meant their wounds could never truly begin to heal. It was in this context of growing frustration that a final, definitive event finally brought closure to the Elias Ransom case, though not in the way anyone expected. In the spring of 1897, a group of loggers working in an extremely remote area of Randolph County made a macabre discovery. At the bottom of a steep canyon, partially covered by vegetation and accumulated debris, they found remains that authorities would later identify as Elias Ransom's. Identification was made through clothing, some personal belongings found near the remains, and physical characteristics that matched known descriptions, including an old fracture in the left arm that had been mentioned in county medical records. The cause of death appeared to be a fall, possibly occurring during the previous winter, when ice and snow made the mountain trails particularly treacherous. Evidence at the scene suggested that Ransom had slipped from a rocky ledge and fallen approximately 100 feet to the canyon floor, where he likely died instantly or shortly after impact. The news of Ransom's death was met with mixed feelings in the communities affected by his actions. There was relief that he no longer posed a threat, but also frustration that there would never be a trial, never an opportunity for victims and families to confront him directly, never definitive answers to many of the questions that remained. His accidental death in the mountains he knew so well had an almost poetic quality, a form of natural justice where the territory he had used for his dark purposes finally claimed him. Sheriff Hutchinson personally traveled to the discovery site, descending into the canyon to survey the scene. He spent hours there, studying every detail, trying to understand the final moments of the man he had hunted for years. Near the remains, partially protected by a rocky ledge, Hutchinson found a small leather pouch containing more documents and a final notebook. This final notebook, damaged by exposure to the elements but still partially legible, contained notes that appeared to be Ransom's personal reflections, thoughts he never expected others to read. Stay with us as we explore what these final notes revealed about the mind of the Appalachian gravedigger and how his legacy would continue to impact the region for decades to come. The final notebook found with Elias Ransom's remains proved to be a disturbing document that offered a dark window into the psychology of a man who had terrorized the mountains for years. The surviving pages contained reflections written at different times, some dated, others with no clear indication of when they were recorded. These were not confessions in the legal sense, but rather fragmented thoughts that revealed how Ransom justified his actions to himself. He wrote about the harshness of life in the mountains, about how death was an inevitable constant in that brutal environment, about his belief that he was merely accelerating processes that nature would complete anyway. There were also passages that demonstrated a deep resentment toward society. Ransom described injustices he claimed to have suffered throughout his life, lost property, denied opportunities, perceived slights that had apparently accumulated over decades. In his warped mind, his actions were a way of correcting imbalances, of taking what he believed was his due. There was no genuine remorse in those pages, only elaborate rationalizations and an attempt to construct a narrative in which he was simultaneously a victim and an agent of an alternative justice system. Sheriff Hutchinson read those words with a mixture of revulsion and morbid fascination, recognizing that he was confronted with a deeply disturbed mind. Interestingly, the notebook also contained vague references to other people, names given only by initials or nicknames, suggesting that suspicions about a wider network were well-founded. But these references were frustratingly ambiguous, impossible to definitively connect to specific individuals without additional context. Hutchinson and other investigators spent months trying to decipher these clues, consulting records from multiple counties and interviewing people who might have known Ransom at different periods in his life. Some leads seemed promising initially, but eventually turned out to be dead ends. The full truth about the extent of Ransom's activities and the possible involvement of others would likely never be fully known. Elias Ransom's body was buried in a municipal cemetery without ceremony or permanent markings, a decision made by authorities to prevent the site from becoming some kind of morbid attraction. No one attended the burial other than the necessary officials and the local gravedigger, an irony not lost on us. The man who had spent so many years offering funeral services, who had used that profession as a cover for terrible acts, was laid to rest without any of the formalities he had denied so many others. It was a fittingly somber conclusion to a life lived in the shadows. In the months following Ransom's death, Appalachian communities slowly began the process of returning to normalcy, but the impact of the case would linger for generations. Families who had lost members under mysterious circumstances now lived with the terrifying confirmation that their worst fears were likely true. In most cases, there were no bodies to bury, no designated location for family members to visit and grieve. The missing remained absent, their stories abruptly cut short, their lives reduced to names on investigation lists and belongings in evidence boxes. The case's legacy extended beyond the personal suffering of the affected families. Systematic changes began to occur in the way authorities handled missing persons in rural areas. Greenbrier County established stricter protocols for investigating disappearances, requiring more detailed documentation and regular follow-up even when seemingly plausible explanations existed. Other counties adopted similar practices, and gradually a more effective communication network was established between different jurisdictions in Appalachia. The profession of gravedigger, particularly in rural areas, came under increased scrutiny. Although the vast majority of these workers were honest people providing a necessary service, communities became more cautious about whom they hired for such services. Preferences began to develop for gravediggers, long known in specific communities, and strangers offering these services faced automatic suspicion. It was a subtle but significant shift in the way these isolated societies operated. The Ransom case also influenced broader discussions about law and order in border regions. Legal scholars and policymakers debated how the legal system could be better adapted to deal with crimes committed in remote areas where evidence was difficult to collect and preserve. Some argued for a greater federal presence in investigations that crossed multiple local jurisdictions. Others advocated for strengthening investigative capabilities at the county level. These discussions eventually contributed to reforms that would significantly modernize law enforcement in rural areas in the following decades. Historically, the Elias Ransom case has become a dark landmark in Appalachian history, frequently mentioned in studies of crime in isolated communities and the challenges of maintaining order in vast, sparsely populated territories. But curiously, despite its notoriety at the time, the case was gradually erased from the broader historical record. Regional history books mentioned it briefly or not at all. Official records were eventually archived so deeply that researchers had difficulty accessing them. It was as if there was a collective desire to forget, to not preserve the memory of those disturbing events. This historical suppression had interesting consequences. In the affected communities themselves, knowledge of Ransom began to be passed down orally, transforming into local folklore. Stories were told around firesides, warnings were given to travelers, and legends developed that blended fact with fiction. In some versions of these stories, Ransom became an almost supernatural figure, a specter that still haunted certain mountain trails. In others, he was portrayed as a methodically efficient serial killer whose true victim count would never be known. The truth, as is often the case, likely lay somewhere in between. Sheriff Hutchinson never fully recovered from his experience pursuing Ransom. He remained in his position for several more years, but those who knew him noticed a change in his demeanor. He became quieter, more prone to periods of melancholic reflection. He had devoted years of his life to the case, emotionally invested beyond his professional duty, and the inconclusive outcome weighed heavily on him. Hutchinson corresponded with several victims' families until his own death in 1907, always offering updates as new information emerged, always willing to discuss the case with anyone seeking understanding. The evidence collected during the investigation was eventually consolidated and stored in the Greenbrier County archives. Boxes containing documents, victims' personal belongings, Ransom's notebooks, and detailed investigative reports were sealed and deposited in a special archive room. For decades, these materials remained virtually untouched, accessible only with rarely granted special permissions. Join us as we explore how the case resurfaced in public consciousness decades later and what lasting impact it had on modern understanding of crimes in isolated rural areas. Decades passed, and the name Elias Ransom gradually faded from collective memory, preserved only in dusty archives and in the whispered stories of descendants of the affected families. Life in the Appalachian Mountains continued its relentless pace, with new generations born unaware of the dark events that had occurred on the same trails and valleys they traveled daily. The world was changing rapidly in the first decades of the 20th century, with automobiles replacing wagons, electricity reaching smaller towns, and modern technologies slowly penetrating even the most remote regions. Appalachia, however, retained much of its isolated character and buried histories. It wasn't until the 1960s that the Ransom case unexpectedly resurfaced in public consciousness. A regional historian named Marcus Whitfield, working on a dissertation on migration patterns in Appalachia during the 19th century, stumbled upon the files related to the case while researching Greenbrier County records. Intrigued by the fragmentary references he found in official documents, Whitfield obtained special permission to examine the sealed materials. What he discovered simultaneously fascinated and horrified him. Here was an extraordinary story that had been deliberately obscured, a case that revealed disturbing aspects of life in isolated communities, but also demonstrated the resilience and determination of ordinary people seeking justice. Whitfield spent 3 years meticulously researching the case, interviewing descendants of investigators and victims, tracing documents scattered across multiple counties, and reconstructing chronologies from fragments of evidence. His work resulted in an academic article published in a regional history journal in 1968. The article brought renewed attention to the Ransom case, though primarily within academic circles. Whitfield treated the subject sensitively, focusing on both the criminological aspects and the social elements that allowed Ransom to operate with impunity for so long. Renewed interest led to re-evaluations of other historical disappearances in Appalachia. Researchers began examining patterns, comparing records from different periods and regions. The understanding slowly emerged that the phenomenon Ransom represented was not unique, but part of a broader problem that had persisted for generations. Geographic isolation, combined with technological and institutional limitations of the time, created conditions where certain types of crimes could occur with relative impunity. This understanding has informed modern studies of rural crime and how isolated communities can develop specific vulnerabilities. Within Appalachian communities themselves, the resurgence of interest in the Ransom case provoked mixed reactions. Some families, descendants of the original victims, were grateful that their ancestors' stories were finally being properly recognized and documented. For them, there was validation in the public acknowledgement of suffering that had been privatized for so long. Other families, however, preferred the past remain buried. There was shame associated with having been victimized, an unfair but persistent perception that those who disappeared had somehow been naive or reckless. This shame had been passed down through generations, creating family silences that were difficult to break. A particularly interesting aspect to emerge from the renewed research was the discovery that several of the leads never followed during the original investigations led to other individuals potentially involved in similar activities. The ambiguous initials and references in Ransom's notebooks, when contextualized with additional records found in other county archives, began to form suggestive patterns. Although decades too late for any legal action, these discoveries confirmed that Hutchinson's suspicions of a wider network were well-founded. The Appalachian gravedigger had not operated in complete isolation throughout his criminal career. In the 1980s and 1990s, as public awareness of serial crime increased dramatically through media coverage of modern cases, there were occasional attempts to re-examine the Ransom case through the lenses of contemporary criminal psychology and profiling. Experts in criminal behavior analyzed the surviving notebooks, attempting to construct a psychological profile of Ransom based on his own words. These studies concluded that he likely exhibited characteristics consistent with a severe antisocial personality, combined with above-average intelligence and exceptional long-term planning abilities. But such analyses were limited by the scarcity of detailed biographical information about his life before his crimes became known. The site where Ransom's remains were found has, ironically, become a point of occasional interest for dark history and true crime enthusiasts. Though remote and difficult to access, some determined adventurers made the trek to the canyon in Randolph County, seeking some connection to the story. Local authorities eventually installed a small historical plaque near the most accessible road, briefly describing the events without going into graphic detail. The plaque simply stated that the area was associated with important historical investigations and that the dangerous terrain should be respected. For modern Appalachian communities, Elias Ransom's legacy serves as a sobering reminder of a past that wasn't always idyllic. There's a tendency to romanticize mountain life, to focus on the natural beauty and resilience of the people while ignoring the real hardships and dangers that existed. The Ransom case resists this romanticization, insisting that history be remembered in its entirety, including its darkest chapters. It's an acknowledgement that even in the most close-knit communities, even in the most beautiful places, the human capacity for evil can find its way into the open. Interestingly, the case also influenced fiction and regional folklore. Appalachian writers occasionally incorporated elements inspired by Ransom's story into their works, though almost always with changed names and altered details. Folk and bluegrass musicians composed ballads that, while never explicitly mentioning Ransom, clearly echoed themes from his story: missing travelers, mountains holding secrets, justice finally achieved through nature itself. These artistic works helped maintain a cultural awareness of the events, even when the actual story remained obscure. The case files, still held in Greenbrier County, were eventually digitized in the early 21st century as part of a larger historical records preservation project. This digitization made the materials more accessible to researchers, albeit under restrictions designed to protect the privacy of descendants and prevent sensationalism. Scholars of criminology, social history, Appalachian studies, and other disciplines occasionally consult these files, each bringing new perspectives to understanding what happened in those mountains over a century ago. What remains most disturbing about the Ransom case are not the specific details of his crimes, but rather the broader questions it raises. How many other similar stories remain completely unknown, buried literally and figuratively deep in the mountains? How many people have disappeared over the centuries in the vast expanses of Appalachia, without their stories ever being told or investigated? Stay with us for the final chapter of this story, where we will reflect on the enduring significance of the Appalachian gravedigger and what his case teaches us about vulnerability, justice, and memory in isolated communities. As we look back through time and try to fully understand Elias Ransom's story, we are confronted with uncomfortable truths about human nature and the weaknesses of the systems we build to protect ourselves. The Appalachian gravedigger was not a monster born from nowhere, but rather a product of specific circumstances: the extreme isolation of mountain communities, the lack of effective communication between jurisdictions, the vulnerability of people who had to travel alone through dangerous territory, and perhaps most importantly, a cultural tendency not to ask difficult questions when convenient explanations were available. Ransom intuitively understood these vulnerabilities and exploited them with disturbing efficiency for years. What makes his case particularly significant is not just the extent of his criminal activities, but what it reveals about how societies deal with invisible threats. For years the signs were there: disappearances following similar patterns, a name repeatedly appearing under suspicious circumstances, families expressing concerns that were dismissed as paranoia or bad luck. Only when someone like Sheriff Hutchinson decided to dedicate time and resources to connecting these disparate dots did the true magnitude of the problem emerge. This teaches us the importance of taking the concerns of marginalized communities seriously, of keeping adequate records, and of not accepting simple explanations for disappearances simply because thorough investigations are inconvenient or costly. The Appalachian Mountains today are very different from those of the late 19th century. Modern roads cut through valleys that were once accessible only by dangerous trails. Communications technologies connect even the most remote cabins to the outside world. Law enforcement systems are infinitely more sophisticated, with integrated databases, advanced forensic analysis, and established protocols for missing persons. But it would be naive to think that the vulnerabilities Ransom exploited have completely disappeared. They have simply taken on new forms, adapted to the contemporary context. Isolation today is not necessarily geographic, but can be social or economic. People still disappear, especially those in vulnerable situations: migrant workers, individuals without proper documentation, people fleeing dangerous domestic situations, and those living on the margins of society by choice or circumstance. The lesson of the Ransom case is that these vulnerable populations require special attention and systematic protection, not because they are inherently weak, but because predators always identify and exploit those whom society neglects or ignores. Constant vigilance, genuine compassion, and robust systems of protection are necessary in every era. There is also a deeper philosophical dimension to Ransom's story worth considering. His notebooks revealed a man who had constructed an elaborate narrative justifying his actions, who saw himself not as a criminal, but as someone exercising a perverse form of justice, or simply hastening the inevitable. This capacity for self-justification, for redefining terrible acts as acceptable or even necessary is perhaps the most frightening aspect of his psychology. It reminds us that great evil is rarely committed by people who see themselves as evil, but rather by those who have managed to convince themselves that their actions are justified, necessary, or simply irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. For the families who lost loved ones in those dark years, closure was never complete. There was no trial where truths were officially established, no formal sentencing to validate their suffering, no specific places where they could visit and grieve. The wounds remained open, passed down through generations as stories of loss and absence. Some descendants of these families still live in Appalachia today, carrying inherited memories of grandparents and great-grandparents who simply disappeared one day and never returned. Their stories are reminders that crimes not only affect direct victims, but reverberate through time, touching lives decades and even centuries later. The Randolph County Canyon, where Ransom met his end, remains largely unchanged since that spring day in 1897. Nature has completely reclaimed the site, with trees growing where his body was found, vegetation covering any sign that anything significant happened there. It is a reminder that the mountains continue, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on their slopes. They existed long before Ransom silently witnessed his crimes, and will continue to exist long after even the memory of his deeds has completely dissipated into the mists of time. But perhaps that's precisely why stories like this need to be told and retold, not out of a morbid fascination with evil, but because to completely forget would be to dishonor those who suffered and those who worked tirelessly to seek justice. Sheriff Hutchinson devoted years of his life to pursuing Ransom, driven not by personal ambition, but by a deep sense of duty to the victims and their families. Prosecutor Caldwell built meticulous cases despite nearly insurmountable obstacles. Thomas Merrick found the courage to testify despite his fear. The woman who escaped in 1896 risked her safety to alert authorities. All of these people represent the best of humanity, the refusal to accept evil, the determination to seek truth and justice even when the path is difficult. Elias Ransom's final legacy should not be a memory of his crimes, but rather an awareness of the conditions that enabled them and a commitment to never allowing such conditions to exist again. It means building societies where no one is so isolated or vulnerable that they can disappear without anyone noticing or caring. It means maintaining justice systems that work for everyone, not just those with resources or connections. It means remembering that behind every missing person statistic is a complete human story, a life lived, relationships formed, dreams maintained. It means refusing to easily accept convenient explanations when something doesn't feel right. The Appalachian Mountains still hold many secrets, stories that will never be fully known, mysteries that will remain unsolved. But every story we can recover, every truth we can establish, every silenced voice we can amplify again, is a small triumph against oblivion. It is an affirmation that lives matter, that truth matters, that justice matters even when it is difficult or inconvenient to seek. The case of Elias Ransom, too bad for many history books, remains a grim testament to these truths. Together we explored this disturbing story, navigated its dark twists and turns, and reached its inconclusive but meaningful ending. If you found this journey through Appalachia's dark past impactful and revealing, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories that unearth history's buried secrets. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this extraordinary case, or if you know of similar stories from your own region. And if you appreciated the research and storytelling that went into this guide, a like will go a long way in bringing these forgotten stories to more people who need to know them. Until the next dark story we'll uncover together.